because, perhaps it's a Slavic trait, the Soviets focused on the enhancement of psi phenomena through the use of emotion in exceptional subjects. Positive or negative emotion. A famous case is one of the experiments Vassiliev made with his top subject, which was a Russian secretary. She was supposed to transmit one of the Soviet coins of the Zener cards to a recipient in another room. And she herself was in a Faraday cage. And just before the experiment began, Vassiliev, he recounts this in his description of the case, came up to her and forcefully said, her son, who was 6 years old, had just been crushed by a tramway going to school. But first they would have to do the experiment and transmit the image of the card, and then she would go to see him at the hospital. And then the recipient in the other room recorded an extremely powerful transmission of the tramway, not of the card she was supposed to transmit, and actually drew it. Then Vassiliev felt this demonstrated, without any doubt, the impact of emotions on the clarity of the transmission. Clearly, from an ethical standpoint, it's rather appalling. The quantitative study of telepathy was largely undertaken by Rhine at Duke University. It has had very mixed results. It has been highly criticized. Basically, working with large numbers of subjects, Rhine had to do with what's known as a very strong decline effect, in which the results, the positive results, decline sharply due to the boredom of the participants. You can imagine what it feels like transmitting thousands of these day after day to people in the next room. You just go, dizzy. And Ryan was seldom able to elucidate the strong ESP, strong psi, Soviet and early French and British research elicited. In response to Soviet research, the US initiated, it seems in the late 60s, early 70s, a series of projects to investigate what was known as remote viewing, which used to be called clairvoyance, the capacity to see at a distance. And these projects have had a dizzying number of names and agencies. We have gone from Project Scanate to Grillflame to ICMP to Project Sanskrit to Project Stargate. And at present, nobody really knows if there is such a project ongoing in the US or not. All these projects, after the late 1980s, seem to have been farmed out to private enterprise, such as the Humanities Foundation, for instance, of C.B. Scott Jones in Virginia. You find, surprise, surprise, that the heads of these organizations are systematically people with close connections with the intelligence agencies. But it provides a lot of deniability for projects which are controversial in nature. Now, one of the two most famous cases of psi data from these projects is a case of remote viewing involving Ingo Swan, one of these star projects of Project Scanate, who seems to have been able to describe the operation of a sealed magnetometer, sealed in a vault in a building, to intelligence agents who were with him at Stanford University. Then this was so shocking that basically it led to his being hired by the project, and Ingo Swan remained one of the mainstays of Project Scanate under its various acronyms to the very end. However, the most striking known case of remote viewing is due to Albert Price, who was the most exceptional candidate used by Project Scanate at the Stanford Research Institute. Harold Price had exceptional mediumistic capacities, And he was requested to actually see what was happening at a remote site in the Soviet Union, Semipalatinsk, which was of interest to the CIA. He made a sketch of what he saw, and this is his sketch. It's the sketch of a huge gurney. And you can see when you compare this sketch with a drawing made by a CIA operative, the striking similarities. Then Pat Price met an untimely and unexplained end. It has been said he died of a heart attack. Many believe he was assassinated. All that can be said is his death was highly suspicious. It was after collision with somebody in the lobby of his hotel. That upon returning to his room, he was seized with convulsions and was basically declared dead within hours. And what is quite striking is that the autopsy formulary were removed from the hospital to which Pat Price was taken, and have never been found since. So some have said that Pat Price's capacities were perhaps the cause of his demise. Others have said it was just a heart attack. We have really no way of knowing. But as of 1995, which is the last data I have, there is an average of 200 tasks which are assigned to these operatives by military organizations. It's a clear indication that such capacities seem to be considered real and perhaps legitimate, or seem to be considered real and legitimate as of 1995 by intelligence agencies. Then we must pass to the second category of psi phenomena, which has been investigated and may provide corroboration for mind-body and mind-matter interaction, psychokinesis. Now, psychokinesis, with its capacity to move or affect matter with the mind alone, was investigated by Robert Jan, head of the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Center or Laboratory, PAIR. And Jan obtained remarkable data. Now, I would like to give you some background regarding Jan himself to give you an idea of the caliber of the investigator involved. Robert Jan was Dean of Engineering at Princeton, Professor of Plasma Physics, founder of the Electrical Propulsion and Plasma Dynamics Lab at Princeton, and a member of the NASA Space Science and Technology Advisory Committee. He was a foremost plasma physicist in the US. And perhaps unfortunately for him, one of his students wanted to write a master's thesis on the possible effect of concentration on a random number generator. And Jan, who had no particular interest in the topic, accepted to direct the thesis. And we can say that it is from this point onwards that his life spiraled downwards. He was very surprised by the quality of the results she obtained. And intrigued, he decided he would try to reproduce them. And then John used a variety of random number generators. Some released balls, others involved pendulums, some were electronic, there were some hydraulic random number generators. And he would ask volunteers to concentrate on the random number generators and try to affect the generation of random numbers in one direction or the other. Now, what Jan found, to his surprise, was an extremely strong deviation from the expected once the number of runs became very, very high. Once one reached a couple 100,000 of runs, Jan found what amounted to highly significant effects. And what is quite striking is that these effects were independent of the type of random number generator used. Whether the random number generator was electrical, electronic, mechanical, hydraulic, the deviation was broadly the same, which seems to preclude this being an artifact of the random generator itself. Then, in his book, The Pair Proposition, John states that he considers such results unlikely by the order of 10 power minus 12. In other words, 1 to 1 trillion. And these results are considered replicable on a large scale. Well, the key features of his research on psi has been that psi effects occur irrespective of the random generator number. They occur over very large samplings. And in my opinion, they seem to suggest weak mind-matter interaction at the non-quantum classical level. So they seem to suggest what we mentioned previously, upwards quantum contamination. A contamination of quantum effects from the microscopic to the macroscopic. The jury isn't in. John's research was hugely controversial. It basically destroyed his career. He was a tenured professor at Princeton, so they had to keep him. But he was eventually given the laboratory in the basement of Princeton, and he had become an embarrassment for Princeton University. Then it's a sign of his personal courage that he continued with his research, despite the cost in terms of reputation and career. So there has been some strong criticism of John's results from an Italian philosopher of science. And Robert Clark, professor of physics at the University of Maryland, which hinges not so much on the experimental procedure used as the significance of the statistical indicator which John used, which is considered to yield abnormal deviations when very large sampling is used. Then the problem with this criticism is basically that it is never invoked for other experiments. It seems to be reserved for psi research, such as the research which John undertook. And also what is very difficult to take on board in Pigliucci's criticism is that John's results are consistent, strikingly consistent. Now, you would expect if these abnormal results were due to the random generator or to statistical aberration, that such consistency would be absent. It's not the case. So, in my personal opinion, it seems difficult to criticize John's research on this basis. What one can say is that because John's research is heavily quantitative, like Ryan's research at Duke University, the effects which are elicited are small, but convincing. In any other field of research, such effects would be considered to prove the existence of some type of. So, in conclusion, I think what we can say is that von Neumann's theory of the observer in quantum mechanics demands that the observer, in other words, human consciousness and perhaps animal consciousness as well, the animals can be observers of quantum phenomena, be non-material. Then we have a large body of evidence at present indicating mind-to-mind communication, in other words, telepathy, and also mind-matter interaction at the macroscopic level. All this seems to indicate that not only is the mind non-material, but mind and matter are not separated by the type of inseparable boundary which is often considered to separate mind and matter in classical philosophy. Then this calls for a lot more research, but I think you can see how this might be relevant to those of us who are interested in Buddhist philosophy. And this is what I had to cover today with you. I thank you for your patience with some very difficult material, and I'm delighted to take your questions.
Thank you very much. Wonderful presentation. I have a question about the double slit experiment, because the more I hear about it, the less I understand. I wonder if you could tell me when the wave function is like this, and there is the interference pattern. Say if when the photon is behaving as a particle, there's a measurement of 1, it goes onto into a little box or whatever. When it's on the wave function, the interferences at different points along that along the photographic plate or something used. Now, do those interferences at the different points, do they equal, say, 1, if when the photon is seen as a particle, it has a value of 1?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Yeah, maybe I'm not sure.
Basically, I talk a bit about waves and particles, and maybe things will become clearer. If you think of waves, perhaps the best simile is waves in water, right? So if you drop one pebble in water, right, you have waves spreading outwards from that pebble, right? So far, so good. Take 2 pebbles, you drop one pebble in water, and then shortly afterwards another pebble. What happens? You drop the first pebble, you have concentric waves spreading outwards. When you drop the second pebble, let's say 1 meter away, you have a second set of concentric waves spreading outwards. When these 2 sets enter in contact, you have a phenomenon known as diffraction. The waves add or subtract in amplitude in function of phase. You can see this. You have circle, 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 and then suddenly you will have a very strange mixture of curves. This is typical wave behavior. Now, when you are dealing with particles, there is no diffraction. And it is the presence or the absence of diffraction which determines whether we are dealing with ondulatory flattened waves or particles. So, what is striking with the double slit experiment is that when one sets out to measure diffraction, one finds diffraction. When one sets out not to measure diffraction, but the impact of photons, let's say on a photoelectric screen, to generate an electric current, one finds indeed the impact of photons on a photoelectric screen. What the experimenter sets out to measure is what he finds. And the big question is, why is this the case? It is, everyone agrees on the experiment. The problem is, how do we interpret it? With all of quantum mechanics at present, everyone agrees in the theories. It is an interpretation which is a minefield. Then the data seems progressively to be favoring those who subscribe to a non-material vision of the mind. Seems to be. The experiments are difficult to make, and obviously each time one experiment is made, sometimes a counter-experiment must be made. But you will find that it is in physics that one encounters the scientists most sympathetic to non-material understandings of consciousness. And it is, for instance, in biology, that one encounters the scientists most unsympathetic to such understanding. Does that help?
Yes, and one slight small clarification. So, when the interference pattern is seen on the photoelectric plate, there's no way to measure the value of, say, for instance, the whole interference pattern. So, say if you fire 5 electrons through and you have a little device which captures them and measures them as a particle, and you fire also 5 electrons through the double slit with the photoelectric plate at the back, you can't then add up the different, I don't know because I'm not a mathematician, you can't add up the different diffraction patterns and get a quantity of 5. So you can't.
Well, we're not dealing with electrons, but photons.
Photons, sorry.
The energy level is exactly the same.
Yes.
The question is...
But is that reflected on the photoelectric plate? Is the energy level...
Well, the energy you would calculate, right? You would know when you want the photons.
Right. So when they do the calculation of
the energy level of particles and waves, in this case, would be identical. Right? I mean, it's not the goal of the experiment to measure that.
Right. So it's irrelevant.
The idea is, we've got a source of light. What happens when we choose to measure what comes out of that source? And we find that it seems as if the nature of the phenomenon is contingent on what we choose to measure, which is very strange.
That's clear, yes.
That is something which is, from the standpoint of classical physics, totally aberrant. It's as if you have a stream of cattle coming out, let's say, of TBI. And if you need goats, it's goats, and if you need cows, it's cows. Whoever heard of something like that? It's when the cattle leave TBI that they're either goats or cows. Right? It's not the case that you're standing outside with someone who says, I want to buy a goat milk, and suddenly the cattle is coming out and they're all goats. This is very strange. But basically, it's a double-slit experiment. This is what we are dealing with. And the question which arises is, why is this the case? Now, if you are saying that light is simultaneously a wave and a particle, that's very difficult as a position to uphold, because waves and particles have completely different behavior. Right? Particles never exhibit diffraction. Waves always exhibit diffraction. Right? So, the best explanation is one in which we consider light in terms of a wave function, and this wave function collapses, and I use the term manifest, it's never used in physics, but manifests as a wave or a function or a particle in function of the experimental setup set up by the experimenter. And then the debate which arises is it a function of the instruments of the measure that this wave function collapse occurs, or is it a function of the intent in the mind of the observer? So the idea that it was in function of the instruments of measure was, I would say, the classical idea of Niels Bohr and of Heisenberg. And it's the easiest for us to take on board. Unfortunately, as time passes, there's more and more data which is very strongly at odds with this. It's not a coincidence that there's a huge amount of interest in von Neumann's formalization at present. Do we have other questions? Yes, please.
Was John's research replicated elsewhere?
There have been attempts to replicate some aspects of his research in remote viewing which failed, but that was not the main thrust of his research. To my knowledge, his research on psychokinesis, which is the main thrust of his research, has not been replicated. To my knowledge.
Thank you. And also, in terms of science and sample size, we have to do power calculations to know the sort of sample size we're looking at because of that problem you were talking about. So it would be unethical just to do thousands or huge numbers without looking beforehand at whether you want to have a small sample size or a large sample size to show whatever effect you're trying to find.
I'm not a statistician, so I really cannot comment on that aspect of his work. He himself seemed very satisfied with it, and he had a series of physicists working for him who were satisfied with it. Then, what can one say?
Yeah, I'm not criticising, I'm just saying that it does occur in other areas as well, not just in physics, so it could be in health, medicine, science in general.
Large sample problems. Yes. Well, that's been the criticism which has been addressed to John's research, that the statistical techniques he used were not appropriate for the scale of the sample. Then one would like to think that someone in his position, with his background, would not be open to that type of criticism. But who knows?
It is a problem, and I guess to try to avoid that sort of problem, those sorts of critiques, usually people nowadays with some of the big experiments try to get statisticians on board early on so that they can raise those sorts of questions and it can be addressed before the experiment is designed.
As you can see from the quotes I mentioned here, the US government asked 2 statisticians, independent statisticians, to assess Psi research, and they came to radically different conclusions within 20 days of each other. One from the University of California at Davis concluded that psychic functioning, based on the government data given to her, had been established beyond reasonable doubt. And another statistician from the American Institute for Research. These are, if you'll forgive me for the term, bogus institutions, which typically are basically government spin-offs. It's typical in the US, it's how it's done, Came to the conclusion that paranormal phenomena had not been established. Same data, 28 days of interval with each other. You can see, it's quite striking. And Jessica Hutz, I'm not quite sure did her career any good from the Division of Statistics of UC Davis, considered that basically the data available for establishing Psi research established it beyond reasonable doubt, whereas M.D. Rose and Mumford from the American Institutes for Research considered that there was no proof that this was due to the operation of paranormal phenomena. So we're dealing, I think, with material which, frankly, is very threatening. It threatens the established paradigm, and this is not just an ideological threat. This has huge impacts on funding, on endowments, on entitlement, on publication. Then, how much objectivity one can hope for is open to question.
What were their qualifications?
Mumford, I don't know. Davies was a statistician.
But to what level? So the other one you mentioned was a doctor, or either PhD.
Davies was a doctor in the Division of Statistics of UC Davis. Then one is entitled to assume that her results were displeasing to the powers that be, because they came out on September 1st, 1995. And 28 days later, that's fast for research of that caliber, an evaluation of remote viewing research and application comes out from the American Institutes of Research saying exactly the opposite. And that's the present state of affairs. It had become very political in America. The evangelicals came into the picture. Then they basically considered that the US government was funding, for practical purposes, Satan worshippers. This is basically the level of the dialogue.
Thank you. I suppose when I read that sort of thing as a scientist, I also look at the wording. So the wording here, evidence has not been provided that clearly demonstrates that the causes of ethics are due to the operation. So I think the way that's been written, and also I guess I would look to see where the work has been published in both cases.
In this case, I have never heard of the American Institutes for Research, whereas I do know UC Davis. Then all I can do is present the data to you, you have to make up your own opinions. I would say that when, with this type of material, one tries to leave the enclave, the ghetto, of Buddhist study centers, then one runs into big trouble. And all those who have tried to investigate objectively phenomena such as telepathy, psychokinesis, or in the case of Ian Stevenson, of whom we will be talking tomorrow, cases of the reincarnation type, have basically faced tremendous professional difficulties. John's reputation was destroyed. Stevenson came close. Well, Stevenson was going to be fired from the University of Virginia in 1966. And it's Chester Carlson, who discovered the Xerox process, who offered a huge endowment to the VA for Stevenson. And they were members of the medical department, which felt that even with an endowment of $1 billion at the period, they could happily live without Ian Stevenson. They didn't want him there. Interestingly enough, we see tomorrow Stevenson's research, no one has ever put in question his methodology. So my feeling is that the bias is so great that at present it would be difficult for such research to be studied objectively, not only because certainly in physics we seem to be in a period of crisis of paradigm. And in such a period there are huge vested interests which must be defended. Objective study is not part of these. And perhaps, from my personal standpoint, a strong argument in favor of much of this material is unambiguous government interest out of academia. In the case of the US government, the Soviet government, the interest is clear to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. Then the military, in my limited experience, is composed of very practical people who are really not terribly interested in dogma, but who are very interested in whether things actually work or don't work. But that level of interest over a long period of time is not insignificant. And that's why I presented this data. It's quite striking that in academia there is very little serious research at present on parapsychology. The funding isn't there. And it's a way of committing academic suicide, literally. I mean, you do your PhD, you're planning for tenure. If you touch something like this, it's finished. Something far less controversial than this, for instance, which is the impact of meditation on the brain. Fascinated Davison, he was doing his PhD at Harvard. You may have heard of Davison. He did some very interesting research at the University of Wisconsin. This is the early 1970s. And his thesis advisor said to him, look, I mean, it's up to you, but literally, you might want to stop attending these Vipassana courses if you intend to get tenure and you intend to publish. And Davison, I suppose, had a choice, he accepted. He put his interest for Buddhist philosophy on the back burner, got tenure at the University of Wisconsin, and then he met with his Holiness Dalai Lama in 1998, I think. And His Holiness somehow must have known about this, because he said to him, something to the effect of, don't you feel you have to live in keeping with your principles? And Davison obviously had tenure at the University of Wisconsin, so he was, once, I don't know in Australia, but in the US, once you have tenure, it is almost impossible to remove it. Then he started his research. I don't know how it has affected his capacity to publish. Like with Stevenson, it's very striking. Stevenson was appointed chairman of the medical faculty at the University of Virginia. I think he was one of the youngest chairmen in UVA's history. UVA has, generally when I was there, it was the second or third medical school in the country. It was Thompson medicine. Then, once Stevenson started his research in cases of the reincarnation type, within a matter of years, he could no longer publish in mainstream journals. And he actually had to create his own journal with other interested scientists, the Journal of Scientific Exploration, which was peer-reviewed by those in the same field. Then, luckily for Stevenson, he had tenure. He had a huge grant, and he lived in Edinburgh. That's the price one pays, And it is very interesting that his research has never been addressed head-on. I find that very striking. I mentioned tomorrow, or I'll show you today. But you see, people say the sort of thing I will show you when they have retired, or they're at the point of retirement. Nobody ever says this otherwise. This peer assessment of Stevenson's research by Doris Kuhlmann-Wilsdorfer, who was Professor of Applied Science at the Department of Physics at the University of Virginia. She was one of the wars, I think she's been one of America's leading physicists. Then she said this after retiring. The statistical probability that reincarnation does in fact occur is so overwhelming, established by thousands of already documented cases of remembered lives, and strongly buttressed by the incidence of birthmarks in conjunction with many of his well-documented cases, that cumulatively, the supporting evidence is not inferior to that for most, if not all, branches of science, whether physics, cosmology, technology, and evolution. And you have a similar comment by the book review editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association. Cases in which the evidence is difficult to explain on any other grounds. Yet the impact of Stevens' research in main science has been nominal. So I think main science does not concern us. We are not in academia here, and I have no future prospects of any type. So thanks to Kensuke Puchi, I can speak very freely without being afraid of any consequences. And even more, I think, a sympathetic to Buddhism, so I don't feel I have to be very wary of what I say in front of you. But in academia, let's say, if I were to make a presentation like this, my fate would be similar. Even at the University of Virginia, when I was a student of Jeffrey Hawkins, we were in the Religious Studies department. A presentation like this, Jeffrey would have spoken to me after. He would have said, you want to be careful. I don't know if that goes towards answering your question. The statistical side I cannot comment upon, but I'm just very struck that certainly in the case of the Psi research in the context of Stanford Research Institute, two independent assessments were requested by the US government in a 1-month period in 1995, and they reached what, to the lay reader, seems to be radically opposite conclusions.
Yeah, thank you. That's really, it was good to hear all of that. guess what I would say, if you look at the second one, Con, they did say that there was a statistically significant difference.
They did.
I think. Yeah. And then they came to the other conclusion, or came to a conclusion.
They did. And that's what's quite striking.
Yeah.
There's a statistically significant laboratory effect, and then it leads to nothing.
Yeah, so evidence has not been provided that clearly demonstrates the causes of the hits. I think that's the key.
How would you provide such evidence?
I don't know whether they're implying something, that something was done behind the scenes that caused it or whatever. I don't know if that's what they're implying. They're not contradicting the other person's statistics. No fraud, or who knows what they meant. They were just, it contradicts, the second sentence does leave the reader with the impression that this isn't right. But they've been very careful about how they've worded it. Shall I put it that way?
Can become very political.
Yeah.
Can become very political. It was a matter of funding, then it was a matter of evangelical support for the Republican administration. You know.
So in that context, how was Richard Con Henry's article in Nature received? Because to talk about the mental universe, and then you were saying in terms of
Richard Con Henry published that the year he retired. Just as I will be talking tomorrow about Pim van Lommel's research on near-death experiences. Pim van Lommel was one of what he was Holland's leading cardiologists. And at the end of a long career which started in the late 1960s, he retired, I think it was in 2002. And in 2002, the year of his retirement, he published an article in The Lancet, which, as you know, is Britain's leading medical publication, on near-death experiences, which he had encountered in his practice as a cardiologist for 40 and some years. Then for 40 and some years, he had to keep his peace. Do you know? It's quite striking. If you look at the dates of these publications, it's published typically within a couple of months of retirement, when nothing can happen anymore.
Yeah. Was it well?
Pretty much.
I've got 3 questions. The first 2 are related. In relation to quantum entanglement, what constitutes interaction, and have not all particles been entangled at the point of the Big Bang?
Well, that's a big question indeed. All particles did interact during the Big Bang. What the effect of that really is, I don't even know how you would address the math of that. Interaction would mean, for instance, let us say, you excite an atom of hydrogen, and as a result of this excitation, the atom emits 2 photons. These photons were emitted from the same source they have interacted. That is sufficient. Then they go their own way, their own route, however long. But what quantum entanglement is saying is that once you have a relationship with somebody, I'm sorry for those of you who have many relationships, you can never break away and get free. There's no such thing as putting an end to relationships in quantum mechanics. They keep haunting you. Then your question is an excellent one. I mean, entanglement is something one uses. Nobody really understands how it's possible, because it's a violation of the special theory of relativity, right? Which states that fields in a vacuum cannot be transmitted at speeds higher than the speed of light. If you have instantaneous particles affecting each other instantaneously over millions of light years, because they were entangled once 100 million light years ago, and a change in the spin of one particle affects instantaneously the spin of the other particle. For instance, the classic case, which is always given, is if you create a pair, particle-antiparticle, right? Then they have opposite spins, right? So when you create this pair, it is stable with opposite spins. So one, we would say, is they don't actually turn, but you imagine that one is turning clockwise, the other is turning counterclockwise. And then they go their separate routes, you know. And for some reason, millions of light years away, the spin of particle A shifts from clockwise to counterclockwise. Then instantaneously, the spin of particle B shifts from counterclockwise to clockwise. And there's no explanation. There's no explanation. So Einstein, to the end of his life, subscribed to what's known as the theory of supplementary parameters, which is that there were unknown parameters, which once they were discovered would make sense of this. And a great physicist like David Bohm tried to create a supplementary parameter theory, which unfortunately is very much at odds with Bell's theorems. So those are the questions. We'll talk about them tomorrow a bit. My personal feeling is that the quantum paradoxes all arise from an attempt to describe an unobserved phenomenon. Now, from the standpoint of Buddhist philosophy, it is not possible to have such a thing as an unobserved phenomenon. An object and the subject perceiving it are interdependent. If you look at this interdependence, you can make sense of a fair number of the paradoxes in quantum mechanics, not all, but a fair number. Then the remaining paradoxes, which Richard Cohn was alluding to, frankly, and we will talk about this tomorrow, seem to vindicate three